a body slumped in straw, hands bound behind its back with a torn silken sash. A red smear trailed from the lips to the neckline, dried and flaking. From the darkness came only the steady drip of moisture from stone, like the ticking of time in a dungeon made for forgetting. No priest came. No requiem was sung. His remains, if the whispers are true, were hastily bundled in rough cloth and set upon a cart like a felled boar. His face, some claimed, was unrecognizable, either from decay or something much worse. This was the fate of the man born heir to a throne, but destined to wear his crown like a noose. This was Edward of Carnarvon, King Edward II of England. Today we unearth the slow descent and grotesque undoing of a monarch, whose weaknesses were known even to the rats that gnawed at his palace larders. He was never meant to rule, not really. Born on April 25, 1284, in a fortress overlooking the grey waters of North Wales, Edward was the fourth son of Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, a king carved from iron and vengeance. The younger Edward, by contrast, emerged into the world soft-fleshed, wide-eyed, and profoundly ill-suited to inherit such a brutal legacy. And yet fate, or rather death, had plans. His older brothers died one by one, some in infancy, some from illness, and one in a tragic accident involving a fall from a horse. So the mantle landed upon the boy. No one expected to wear it. Even his name was a political choice, Edward, after his father, Carnarvon, to remind the conquered Welsh who ruled them. By age 6, he was declared Prince of Wales, the first English monarch to officially bear that title. But while his father tested armor and measured battle maps, Edward learned the harp. He loved music. He admired beauty. His soft hands blistered during hawking trips. He preferred feeding swans to training horses. It might have been endearing, had he not been destined to govern a kingdom drowning in cold steel and colder ambition. Contemporary observers remarked that he was strong of body but feeble of mind. One chronicler noted his strange delight in rowing boats up and down the Thames by himself for hours. Another noted his tendency to surround himself with commoners, masons, carpenters, and most controversially, handsome young men of unusual influence. The most prominent among them, Piers Gaveston. But Gaveston doesn't arrive until later. First, let us dwell in the early reign of a man thrust into power with all the preparation of a lamb led to a butcher. When Edward I died in 1307, the entire realm held its breath. Would the son possess a fraction of the father's iron will? He did not. Almost instantly, the court began to slip from the rigid martial order Edward I had imposed. Nobles grew bolder. Taxation faltered. Discipline frayed at the edges. There was no unifying hand gripping the reins. Instead, there was Edward II, smiling gently, speaking softly, and parading his friend Gaveston with an affection that boiled over into open scandal. But even before Gaveston's return from exile, the seeds of decay were already germinating in the crown. The nobles looked at Edward and saw a puppet, if not of Gaveston, then of his own indulgences. He was generous to a fault, prone to giving lands and titles to those who pleased him. Often it was said he gave not out of policy, but affection. One legend claims he once knighted a courtier simply because the man had sung well after dinner. His coronation in 1308 was a strange affair. The lavish feast was marred by a riot in the kitchens, where scullery boys clashed over portions of roast meat. Rumors of foul omens circulated. The wine turned sour, a tapestry collapsed mid-ceremony, and the sky blackened unnaturally early that evening. Historians still argue whether this was mere superstition or an early sign that Edward's reign would court disaster. More practically disturbing was the emerging pattern of absentee governance. Edward preferred the comforts of his personal chambers, lavish entertainments, and extended progressions through the countryside. Court records from his early reign show expenditures on velvet cushions, exotic foods, and falcons imported from North Africa, while English outposts in Scotland starved or rebelled. And yet, amidst this slackening of royal rigor, there was something more haunting. Edward seemed blind to danger. He did not fear treachery. He did not prepare for betrayal. Even when warned of plots, he dismissed them with a shrug or a smile. His own wife, Isabella of France, noticed this flaw early. Married to Edward at the age of 12, Isabella was shrewd beyond her years. She watched her husband lavish honors on Gaveston, ignore her in public, and surround himself with young courtiers who laughed a little too freely in his presence. What she may not have known then, but would exploit later, was how utterly alone Edward would be when the storm finally broke. There are records of his daily meals, too. They show a curious fondness for spiced eels, preserved fruits, and clotted cream, a heavy diet for a monarch who rarely exercised. One physician noted that Edward suffered from chronic indigestion, which may have contributed to his famously erratic temper during council meetings. That's the fringe detail most forget, not the grandeur, but the gastric rot. Edward's reign began not with blood, but with bloating. And with each passing month, the air around him thickened, heavy with court gossip, resentment, and the slow, sour breath of revolt. By 1311, he had already begun to lose the kingdom he barely seemed to understand, and the wolves were already sniffing the court doors. Piers Gaveston returned from exile wearing silk. His boots clapped against the marble of Westminster with the careless confidence of a man untouchable. He smiled at bishops. He winked at knights. He insulted the nobility with a tongue sharpened by years of knowing he could do so without consequence. For he was the favorite, the sun around which Edward's attentions orbited. Their bond had begun years earlier, when Edward was still a prince, and Gaveston merely a Gascon knight of middling birth. Edward's father, Edward I, had exiled Gaveston once already, sensing that the young man was becoming too influential, a corrupter of royal judgment, the old king muttered on his deathbed. But the moment the old lion died, the prince-turned-king brought his companion back. Not quietly, not discreetly, but with a parade of honor, granting him the title of Earl of Cornwall, a title so sacred it had only ever gone to royal blood. The barons were appalled. Cornwall? For him? What made the insult fester deeper was Gaveston's behavior. He wasn't content to be silent and grateful. He mocked the highborn earls. He called the Earl of Warwick the Black Dog, and referred to the Earl of Lancaster as the Fiddler. At tournaments, he wore clothes brighter than the Queen's. At feasts, he sat beside Edward, even when the Queen herself was demoted to a lower seat. And Edward? He laughed at every jibe, fed Gaveston grapes by hand, and penned elaborate odes to his friend's loyalty and brightness. The question of the era, whispered behind hands, scribbled in monkish margins, was whether their bond was carnal. Did Edward love Gaveston as a king loves a subject, or as something more? Historians still argue. Some point to letters thick with emotional language, some to Isabella's cold detachment, and others to Edward's later obsessions with equally handsome companions. Yet no direct proof survives, only a wake of envy, power plays, and bodies. Because make no mistake, Gaveston's presence made enemies, deep ones. By 1311, the barons forced Edward to accept a series of reforms known as the Ordinances. Among the demands, Gaveston must be exiled again. Edward signed, bitter and humiliated, then spent the following months doing everything in his power to undermine the agreement. When Gaveston was banished, Edward followed him to the coast in tears, according to one eyewitness. Not long after, Gaveston reappeared, this time without permission, claiming royal pardon. The barons had had enough. In 1312, they hunted him down like a rabid dog. It was Warwick, the Black Dog, who took custody. Gaveston was dragged to Warwick Castle, denied a priest, denied appeal, denied breath. They beheaded him on a hill, his head striking the ground with a dull, final thud that echoed far beyond the moors. His body was left in the sun. Some accounts say Edward kept Gaveston's embalmed corpse at his side for months before burial, unwilling to let go. After Gaveston's death, Edward changed, but not in the way a wiser king might. He didn't retreat. He retaliated. Rather than learning restraint, he sought new favorites. Hugh Despenser the Younger and his equally ruthless father. If Gaveston had mocked the nobles, the Despensers humiliated them. They seized lands, manipulated courts, and extorted families, under Edward's full protection. It became clear that Edward did not just have a blind spot for personal attachments. He weaponized them. If the barons loathed someone, Edward clutched tighter. The worse his favorites behaved, the more he leaned into them, as if their defiance of the nobility somehow validated his authority. Isabella, his queen, watched all of this from the shadows. She had given him a son in 1312, Edward of Windsor, a boy who would one day become Edward III. But even motherhood could not shield her from her husband's contempt. While she raised the heir, the Despensers rose like mold upon the crown. Isabella endured in silence, for a time. But the kingdom was rotting. Famine swept the land in 1315-17. Grain withered in flooded fields. Starving peasants boiled grass and chewed bark. One village reportedly exhumed buried corpses and roasted them. Meanwhile, Edward feasted. Court records show imports of peacock meat and sweetened wine from Aquitaine, even as the countryside turned to bone and ash. The king's priorities were never clearer, and his enemies multiplied. What is often missed in the grand historical arcs is how deeply hated Edward became not just as a monarch, but as a man. He was perceived as aloof, indulgent, unmanly. His enemies did not merely seek to unseat him. They wanted him humiliated, unkinged. By 1321, a rebellion flared again, this time against the Despensers directly. The Marcher Lords, a brutal collection of warlords along the Welsh border, rose in fury. They razed Despenser property, burned his manors, declared him a tyrant. Edward, now with the full loyalty of the Despensers, responded with terrifying vengeance. He marched into the west, crushed the rebels, executed barons. One was hanged from a public gallows, wearing only his underclothes, a spectacle meant to shame as well as kill. Edward had learned how to punish, but he had not learned restraint. By the early 1320s, even Isabella, the once quiet observer, began to turn. Edward had given her lands to the Despensers. He had allowed them to humiliate her in court. Some say Hugh Despenser even entered her private quarters without invitation. Her silence cracked, and in that crack, the cold wind of conspiracy began to whistle. Here lies the first true twist in Edward's fate. He trusted too blindly, hated too passionately, and dismissed his wife too completely. And she, a daughter of France, did not forget. She would bide her time. She would travel to her homeland. She would return with an army. But before that, Edward would become a prisoner in all but name, cocooned in courtly luxury, but with every thread tightening around his throat. He still called himself king, even as the walls closed in. By 1325, Edward II was king in title only. His grip on the kingdom, never firm, was now butter in sunlight. His wife, Isabella, once the silent queen in the background, had vanished from court. Officially, she was in France to negotiate peace over Gascony. Unofficially, she had no intention of returning, not as a wife, and certainly not as a subordinate. What she returned with was a rebellion. Isabella had formed an alliance with Roger Mortimer, a Marcher Lord and former prisoner of Edward's wrath. Mortimer had escaped the Tower of London in 1323 through bribery, subterfuge, and a rope of knotted sheets. Fleeing to France, he found an ally in the wronged queen, and together they planned a quiet, devastating storm. Isabella's war was not fought with chaos, but calculation. She used propaganda with surgical skill, branding herself the true wife of England, and declaring the Despensers as enemies of God. Her forces landed in Suffolk in September 1326 with little resistance. The barons, long chafing under Edward's favoritisms and humiliations, defected en masse. Castle gates opened. Banners fell. The tide turned with frightening speed. Edward fled. He grabbed Hugh Despenser the Younger and a shrinking entourage and galloped west toward Wales, hoping to find refuge in the heartland of his youth. But Wales did not open its arms. The rivers swelled. The roads turned to sludge. The king, once laced in velvet and feathers, now slept in barns and begged for loyalty that no longer existed. By November, they were captured. Despenser was dragged before a tribunal and condemned. His sentence was not just death, but degradation. He was tied naked to a wooden hurdle and dragged through the streets. A crown of nettles pressed into his scalp. He was hanged, but cut down alive. Then his genitals were hacked off and thrown into a fire for seducing the king, the announcer cried. His entrails followed, yanked from his body and burned before his eyes. At last, he was beheaded. His corpse was quartered and scattered across 4 cities. Edward was forced to watch. Witnesses described the king as pale, trembling, eyes unfocused. He was led away in chains, no longer referred to by any royal title. One guard slapped him when he hesitated. Another spat at his feet. The nobles no longer feared him. They had already begun to forget him. He was moved from castle to castle like a cursed heirloom. Kenilworth. Then Berkeley. It was there, in that thick-walled fortress surrounded by moors and mist, that Edward's dignity dissolved completely. He wore rags. He was kept under constant watch. His cell was damp and windowless, lit only by a slit in the stone. No letters. No counsel. No bed, only straw. Rats nested in the corners. Berkeley Castle became the tomb of the living king. His captors were cautious. Killing a monarch, even a deposed one, was no simple matter. It required subtlety or plausible deniability. So Edward was subjected not to execution, but erasure. Some chroniclers speak of psychological torment, screams in the night, sleep deprivation, rotten food. One account, dismissed by many but never disproven, suggests they kept him beside a decomposing animal carcass for days to break his mind. He grew sickly, gaunt, his hair thinned, skin grayed. He reportedly spoke to shadows, sang to himself in forgotten French, and begged passing guards to deliver letters to a mother who had been dead for decades. Meanwhile, a document was forged. In January 1327, under pressure from Parliament and Isabella, Edward was coerced into abdication. His son, a boy of 14, was crowned Edward III. The old king was no longer king. He was now simply Edward of Carnarvon again, if he had ever truly stopped being that child in the castle by the sea. Officially, he was now a former monarch in quiet retirement. In truth, he was a liability that could not be allowed to survive. In the months that followed, rumors of an impending accident buzzed across noble halls. His jailers were replaced. Mortimer issued cryptic letters about the final handling of the prisoner. Even Isabella, so careful until now, distanced herself from the coming act. Then, on the night of September 21st, 1327, something happened. The records are maddeningly vague. A mishap, one account says. Another reports the king died of melancholy. Still another claims he fell ill. But then there is the most infamous version, the one with the red-hot poker. According to a chronicle written a generation later, Edward was pinned down by 2 men and a hollow horn inserted into his rectum. Through it, a searing iron rod was driven, burning his internal organs without leaving external marks. A method chosen, supposedly, for plausible deniability. No cuts, no bruises, only the scream. It's a scene so lurid, so theatrical, that modern historians debate whether it was invention, a metaphor made literal by the outrage of the time. And yet the consistency of the detail across multiple sources is unsettling. The silence of Isabella and Mortimer in the aftermath only deepens the suspicion. There were no final words. No funeral rites. His body, what remained of it, was displayed in public behind a veil, so the people might mourn without seeing. And still, even then, doubts whispered along the cobblestones. Was it really him? Some swore the body bore little resemblance. Others claimed Edward had escaped, spirited away to Italy or Ireland, living under a false name. One even alleged he saw Edward alive a decade later in a monastery. But the truth, like the body, was buried deep in stone and scandal. The scream, they said, echoed for hours. Whether it came from Edward or from the bones of the castle itself, some spectral groan of a once-crowned ghost, no one could say. But Berkeley Castle never quite slept again. The guards who had been on watch that night refused to speak. One turned up dead weeks later. The others vanished into obscurity, their silence as damning as any confession. Officially, Edward of Carnarvon was dead. His body, what could be verified of it, was interred in Gloucester Abbey. The tomb, surprisingly lavish, featured a full-length effigy in gilded robes. A slab of marble. Prayers were said. Monks paid. But the wound left in the English psyche remained open. Because England had done something irreversible. It had killed its king. Not in battle. Not by illness. But in cold shadow, by silent order. Through a mechanism that bypassed sword and justice alike. And yet, for all its horror, Edward's death did not bring peace. In fact, it made things worse. Roger Mortimer and Isabella now ruled through the young Edward III. The boy king was a puppet, draped in crown and velvet, while Mortimer pulled the strings. The realm noticed. Nobles who had supported the rebellion soon grew disillusioned. The Despensers were gone, but in their place stood another tyrant, one just as greedy and more cunning. Mortimer, unlike Edward II, did not have the luxury of charm. His rule was marked by arbitrary executions, suspicious wealth accumulation, and open disdain for the council. Isabella, once the beloved queen turned liberator, now seemed aloof, even arrogant. The glamour of resistance had curdled into the stench of hypocrisy. One noble observed, "We removed the lion only to let the vulture feast." Meanwhile, stories of Edward II's final days began to twist into legend. Was the poker real? Was it metaphor? Or was the king still alive, hiding beyond the sea? A letter emerged, real or forged, alleging that Edward had escaped and now lived among Italian monks. The missive was vague but vivid, describing a man broken in body but serene in faith. Parliament dismissed it. Scholars debated it. Commoners whispered it like a ghost story. But young Edward III was not content to wonder. In 1330, 5 years after his father's death, he struck. Still only 18, the boy king orchestrated a palace coup. Mortimer was seized in Nottingham Castle, through a secret tunnel beneath the walls. He was dragged before the council, denied a full trial, and executed at Tyburn like a common thief. His body hung for days. Isabella was spared but stripped of her power and lands. She lived out her life in comfortable exile at Castle Rising, haunted, so they say, by visions of fire and screams in stone. Edward III would go on to become one of England's most celebrated kings. He rebuilt the monarchy's reputation, launched the 100 Years' War, and transformed chivalry into spectacle. But the shadow of his father never quite lifted. Because no matter how glorious the sun became, the stain remained. Edward II's reign had not just ended in failure, it had ended in erasure. And yet, his memory persisted. His tomb at Gloucester became a site of quiet pilgrimage. Candles were lit, prayers muttered. Some said miracles occurred, healings, visions, dreams. It wasn't canonization, but it was something close, an unofficial martyrdom of a man too strange, too emotional, too unkingly for his brutal age. Historians today still pick over the bones. Was Edward a weak ruler undone by love? Or a visionary overwhelmed by rigid tradition? Was he truly killed in that monstrous way? Or was the story planted as political theater, a cautionary tale to future kings about indulgence and favoritism? One curious detail often goes overlooked. In the months before his death, Edward reportedly carved odd symbols into the stone walls of his cell. Circles, eyes, a crude crown with thorns. One guard thought it was madness. Another believed it was prophecy. One of the carvings, barely visible now beneath layers of damp lichen, reads, "I was not what you feared. You were." It may be apocryphal, but it lingers, like smoke in a cold corridor. Because Edward II was not simply a bad king. He was a reminder that monarchy, even clothed in silk and blood, is still made of flesh. And flesh, when pressed by steel and envy, breaks. Time softened the details, but it never erased the horror. By the late 14th century, Edward II had become something else entirely. A mirror for England's guilt, a fable for courtiers, a caution whispered in corridors. Children of nobles were told his story as a warning. Do not trust favorites. Do not cross the queen. Do not forget who watches in the dark. His name became a stain, then a myth, then a strange echo of pity wrapped in royal gold. The truth remained sealed in Berkeley stone. Edward III, perhaps to cauterize the wound, poured money into his father's tomb. The monument was impressive, carved alabaster, crowned with a painted effigy, surrounded by candles that never seemed to go out. But even as the abbey filled with prayers, no canon ever called him a saint. Because something stuck. That scream. Chroniclers, official ones anyway, refused to confirm the details. Most danced around it. Some omitted the death entirely. But fringe texts, written in cramped Latin in the margins of obscure monasteries, repeated it with disturbing consistency. The iron, the horn, the fire from within, and then nothing. The medical logic of the tale makes some scholars wince. A red-hot poker would destroy tissue. Yes, but to kill without leaving external burns? To avoid infection, hemorrhage, sound? It seems unlikely. Surgical precision in a time of leeches and superstition? Stranger still. Historians argue whether the tale was symbolic, a narrative invention to frame Edward's death as divine punishment for sexual sin. A medieval morality play, cast in iron and flame. And yet why so specific? Why so consistent? Even modern coroners, pressed to analyze the account, find it suspiciously coherent for folklore. If it were invented, it was done with surgical imagination. Or more troublingly, it was a well-documented act of political anatomy, one designed not only to end a man, but to erase the concept of that man. No body to inspect. No wounds to question. Only fire, internal, untraceable. England had not merely murdered a king. It had cauterized him. Edward II's greatest threat to power had never been his policy or warcraft. It was his softness, his public affection, his emotionality, his favoritism, yes, but also his need, so plainly shown, for connection. He wept openly. He trusted deeply. He clung to his chosen few not as pawns, but as anchors. And that was unacceptable. To the brutal scaffolding of medieval kingship, a ruler who felt was already diseased. He was the wrong kind of man at the wrong time on the wrong throne. That he was gay, or at least had romantic intimacy with men, is almost beside the point. What doomed him was that he made that vulnerability visible. He mourned favorites too loudly. He kissed them too fondly. He did not posture strength. He craved belonging. And so they set him on fire from the inside out. By the Renaissance, his story was twisted again. In Marlowe's 1592 play, Edward II, the king becomes a tragic romantic, doomed not for misrule, but for love. It was, in its own way, a reclamation. But even then, the play ends in fire. That detail refuses to die. The red-hot poker haunts English history not because it's certain, but because it could have happened. Because England in 1327 was capable of it. Because the castle was cold, the guards loyal, the court silent, and the silence complete. To this day, visitors to Berkeley Castle report strange sensations near the old cell. A sudden pressure in the air. An invisible weight pressing down on the chest. One monk in the 1600s claimed he heard muffled screams from the wall itself. He was dismissed, but he never re-entered that wing. Down in Gloucester Abbey, where Edward's effigy lies, the air is cooler than elsewhere in the nave. The tomb draws fewer visitors than other kings. But those who stop linger too long. They read the inscription, worn but visible. Here lies Edward, once King of England, cruelly slain, piteously mourned. No one knows who commissioned that line. It appears nowhere in official record. But it endures. So does the mystery. So does the whisper. He died in silence, but not unseen, not forgotten, not forgiven. Wind down 300 words. Let us leave the stone halls now. Let us turn from the smoke and salt and steel. Outside, the air is clearer. The sky above Gloucestershire, quiet, open, has long since forgotten the weight of screams. The winds that once curled around towers now pass freely over grass, hedgerow, and Abbey Stone. Time has its mercy. It blankets the jagged, softens the grotesque, and lets wounds become stories. Edward of Carnarvon, the king who reigned too gently, died too brutally, and was mourned too little, lies now in peace beneath layers of prayer and dust. His marble effigy does not bleed. His carved eyes do not weep. Whatever horrors visited him at Berkeley, real or imagined, they no longer cling. They echo only faintly, like the toll of a forgotten bell at dusk. The guards are gone. The chains are rusted. The throne he lost has long since passed through generations. But his shadow remains. In cautionary tales, in whispered myths, in the quiet unease that clings to any unchecked power. For England learned a truth it rarely spoke aloud, that kings are flesh, that crowns are no armor, that cruelty, once summoned, is never fully tamed. And so we walk away slowly, step by step, stone to soil, grave to ground, leaving behind a story not of justice or villainy, but of consequence, of how a crown can slip, and how, sometimes, what's left behind is not a legacy, but a scream in stone.